In this video, we'll look at the development of slavery in North America with obviously a special focus on the South. Contrary to popular belief, the first blacks in what became the United States weren't slaves, but rather indentured servants. Blacks were on board the same ship that brought the first women to Jamestown about 1618 to 1620, and the ship's manifest read that there were 20 Africans aboard. It was, by the way, the women who were auctioned off and sold, not the blacks at this point. Indentured servants were a way to attract more settlers. Poor people who couldn't afford the passage to the New World would sign a contract called an indenture. Merchants or sea captains negotiated the agreements on the docks of London or Bristol or wherever the poor happened to come. And upon arrival in the New World, these merchants or sea captains would then sell the contracts to local planters or aristocrats who needed labor. The indentures, as they were called, bound the poor to the planter for a period of years, started about 4 or 5 years, but later became a bit longer, in exchange for the cost of paying the trip over. Later, those under 16 were obliged to work until the age of 21. Again, for everybody else, it was extended to about a period of 7 years. Anyway, in exchange for the labor, the planter provided food, shelter, and clothing. And at the end of the period, the planter was obliged to assist the servant in establishing him or herself. The system worked well. It attracted settlers and made handsome profits of the planters. During the 1620s to the 1650s, the average number of indentured servants per year was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 in Virginia alone. In Virginia's initial period, the indentured servants produced on average 5 times the cost of his or her contract. The system nevertheless could be quite cruel. The planter strictly regulated his servants' lives. He had the legal right to beat them for disobedience or poor work, and to grant or withhold permission to marry. Uncooperative servants could have their contracts sold to others, and thus they would have to go to work elsewhere and so forth. In Virginia, one observer remarked, quote, "Servants were sold up and down like horses," unquote. Many of the indentured servants were women who, not surprisingly, were used for sex. It's estimated in Virginia that 1 out of 5 female indentured servants became pregnant by their owner, the owner of their contract. Here's one quote: "Dissolute masters have gotten their maids with child and yet claim the benefit of their service," unquote. The number of blacks in Virginia initially grew very slowly. In 1625, there were only 23. 15 years later, Africans made up only 300 out of the 15,000 people that were in Virginia. In these early years, with the few number of blacks, their status varied. After serving out their indentured servitude, several blacks became quite wealthy, although no blacks were ever elected to the Virginia General Assembly, I should note. One black, a man named Anthony Johnson, apparently owned a number of indentured servants himself. However, afterwards, as their numbers increased, the colonists began to discriminate on the basis of race. Blacks were not allowed to bear arms, and female black indentured servants were put to work in the fields, but not female white indentured servants. Opposition to sexual relations or marriage between the races became more institutionalized. In 1630, for example, a white guy was whipped, in the words of the court, for, quote, "defiling his body and lying with a Negro," unquote. In 1664, the Virginia law spoke of, quote, "shameful matches," unquote. The growing discrimination was most notable in the length of the blacks' period of indentured servitude. A Virginia court in 1640 added several years to the terms of 2 runaway white servants, but sentenced the black who ran away to servitude for life. The fact that the price paid for black indentured servants was increasing proves the point that the period of service was increasing as well for those of African descent. Soon the colony of Virginia began to pass increasingly restrictive legislation that clearly indicates that they were moving towards slavery. In Virginia in 1650, you could even find life in servitude was beginning to be negotiated. Why would somebody in Africa negotiate to work for the life? Well, if they had kids, they'd be a free kid and they'd be in the New World. But Anyway, by 1661, Virginia had become the first colony to draft an official slave code, which was pretty representative of slave codes in all the colonies later on. Slaves were not permitted to leave plantations without written permission of their masters, and anybody caught without such permission wandering about were forcibly returned. Slaves found guilty of murder or rape could be hanged, and for other major offenses such as robbery, slaves would receive 60 lashes or placed in the pillory where their ears could be cut off. For petty offenses, they could be whipped, branded, or maimed. Petty offenses included even things like just insolence or associating with whites. One of the major obstacles to the development of full-fledged slavery in Virginia was the commonly held belief that only heathens might be enslaved, and that Christianity freed one from bondage. Now, this might have been one of the most important reasons why blacks that first come to Virginia were not immediately thrust into slavery, but perhaps inspired by the way the Catholic, Spanish, and Portuguese had rationalized their slavery, Virginia colonists soon began saying the blacks were, quote, so savage and barbaric that they were justified in slavery because it would civilize and Christianize the Africans. During the first half of the 17th century in Virginia, people began to use the word, quote, Christian, unquote, to distinguish themselves from blacks. In 1667, the Virginia General Assembly decreed, quote, the conferring of baptisms doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom, unquote. Historians have debated the reasons slavery developed. Some say racism. Blacks look so different and were different in culture, it scared many whites. Some historians have even traced the English language to it in its development and determined that anything to do with black or dark always had negative connotations. For example, the Black Death in the 1300s, the Black Knight in lore was always the bad knight. Hell was presented as being dark and whatnot. But it's not just racism. Everybody agrees that certainly economics had much to do with it. And really, this had to do with tobacco. Tobacco was a time-consuming and laborious process, and it required a lot of workers that the colony of Virginia just did not have. When the tobacco plant was little, it had to be protected from the sun, and when it was large enough to be replanted in the sun, it would grow and have to be maintained, and eventually you'd have to do what they called topping, which is cutting off the flower by hand, which then helped the tobacco develop. Once the tobacco had been harvested, you couldn't just automatically sell it. You had to cure it in a proper environment, and that made the tobacco more palatable. Often you would hang it in a barn. Ultimately, the cured tobacco would have to be wrapped into hogshead and stored for the next ship out. But this whole process just required a ton of labor. Recently, historians have sort of agreed on a more complex explanation for why slavery developed in North America. It wasn't just racism, although that was certainly a part, and it wasn't just simplistically the tobacco labor necessary. It involved a little more detail involving several factors. First, by the 1650s, you're going to begin to see that production of tobacco is going to outstrip European demand. There was a glut of tobacco. Tobacco production had grown tremendously. By the 1650s, there was just a tremendous drop in the price of tobacco. Initially, there had been huge profits for planters, but by the 1650s, everyone was trying to get a piece of the action, so there's overproduction, simply supply and demand. Rather than realizing that the solution was collectively cutting production, these tobacco growers tried to produce more, while at the same time cutting cost. At this time, the colonies were more developed and the mortality rates were dropping. The death rates were dropping. Simply put, more people were living longer. What the declining mortality rates meant was that for the first time, more indentured servants were completing their promised period of servitude, when their master would have to set them free and then purchase a new indentured servant contract. Before, most would simply have died before the end of their contract. Facing the new reality of having to purchase a series of indentured servant contracts, the possibility of slavery, was a cheaper alternative now. While a slave would cost more at the outset, he would have to work for life. Before, it didn't make economic sense to pay more for a slave when most would die within a short period anyway. Slavery, therefore, grew out of the tobacco indentured servant economy. And I might add that Africans were perfect for slavery. The Spanish had already used African slavery in New Spain to great profits, and that was a great example for the English. And also because the Africans appeared so different, it's easy to distinguish who was a slave and who was not. As I've said, English culture had long perceived anything dark or black as evil. In Maryland, the development of slavery proceeded in the same way as in Virginia. Maryland and Virginia were similar. They were both tobacco-based. Maryland officially recognized slavery 2 years after Virginia. In 1663, Maryland recognized it. But if anything, it appears that there were more cases of full-fledged slavery even earlier in Maryland. As early as 1634, there were references to slavery in some of the legislative debates, but historians knew little about exactly what this meant or for whom. Anyway, some historians think that the presence of blacks in Maryland was a contributing factor to the religious strife that had characterized the colony in its early years. Maryland had been founded as a haven for English Catholics, but some Protestant settlers outnumbered them and viewed the ruling Catholic minority with suspicion. The Protestant majority began to believe that Indians and Maryland blacks were plotting with the Catholics. And this might have led to Maryland's harsh new rules prohibiting large meetings of African Americans, blacks. In Maryland, as in Virginia, there was some evidence of slave resistance. In Virginia, in 1687, a major plot on the Northern Neck, the peninsula above Jamestown, was discovered and crushed before it began. In 1694, Virginia Governor Edmund Andros publicly complained that the laws were insufficient to protect the whites from possible slave uprising. In Maryland, there were several instances in which white masters died at the hands of their slaves. One case involved a black slave cook who poisoned his master. In 1742, 7 blacks were executed for the murder of their white masters. Slavery in the Carolina colony was pretty much a foregone conclusion. I should note that Carolina was founded as a single proprietary colony, but developed differently over time. In the South, there were better harbors and rivers, rice would grow better and so forth, and there were therefore more people and more large plantations. In the North, at the Outer Banks and its swamps, there were less people and less large plantations, and the two eventually became separate colonies in the 1700s. Anyway, initially, the proprietors of the Carolina colony did all they could to promote slavery and slave trade coming to Carolina. 4 of the original proprietors were members of the Royal African Company and knew firsthand the profits that could be made from slavery. And if you think about it, these 4 stood to benefit from slavery in 2 ways, their colony and the trade. The proprietors were well aware by 1680 that slavery was nearby in Virginia and Maryland, and it was working for them. Anyway, in 1663, the proprietors offered to the original settlers 20 acres for every black male slave and 10 acres for every black female slave that they brought to the colony over the next year. Smaller incentives were offered in later years. And not surprisingly, the population of blacks in Carolina thus rose quickly. Only 20 years after the original settlement, blacks equaled the number of whites. By 1715, the blacks actually outnumbered whites 10,500 to 6,250. And 10 years after that, in about 1725, there were 3 times the number of blacks as whites. The quick growth of the blacks ensured a quick development of firm slave codes. It was similar development as we discussed in Virginia, only a bit quicker taking place. With the numbers, many whites feared a slave revolt, and as it turned out, they had good reason to do so. In 1711, rumors spread of a coming slave revolt and scared the hell out of a lot of the plantation owners. In 1720, several slaves were burned alive, and others were banished when they were implicated in revolt near Charleston. One of the most famous of all the colonial slave revolts took place in Carolina in 1739, the Stono Rebellion. 20 miles west of Charleston, slaves killed 2 guards in a warehouse and they got a bunch of guns, and they began trying to organize and arm other blacks to destroy slavery in the colony. Anyway, that resulted in several days of fighting, and in the end there were 30 whites and 44 blacks killed, so it was pretty violent. The result of this was, of course, fear among the whites. And you do get a real precise slave code developing in South Carolina. Interestingly, while it was real harsh on the blacks in some respects, it also sort of defined, rather than other colonies, more what whites could do in regard to their black slaves. And maybe that was a tactic to admission that the ill treatment of the blacks could actually lead to revolt. The owners, for example, couldn't sell liquors to slaves. They couldn't work slaves more than 15 hours per day between March and September, and more than 14 hours a day between September and March. So, it was a little more defined there, and maybe a little more lenient. It's an interesting anomaly. Anyway, North Carolina, as it turned out, slavery turned out to be less strict than arguably anywhere else in the South. Now, again, that was due to its topography and the lack of harbors. There weren't as many large plantations, and they were more poor, and the people couldn't afford slaves. And so, there was the slavery that was there was on small farms more, and people developed personal relationships with them, and it all added up to not one recorded incident of a slave rebellion in the North Carolina during the colonial period. Georgia was different still than the other southern colonies, and thus slavery developed differently there than elsewhere. Georgia was under direct royal control, and it had been established in the 18th century, 1733, very late. And it was, by the way, only colony of the original 13 that was founded in the 18th century. And these royal rules, these crown rules, had stipulated no free land grants, no alcoholic beverages, and no slavery. Now, as it grew, settlers began to put pressure for changing these rules, and one by one the rules fell. In 1750, after the third petition to the king, he allowed the prohibition against slavery to drop. And from that point on, the black population of slaves grew rapidly. In 1760, there were 6,000 whites and 3,000 blacks. Only 13 years later, it's estimated that there were 18,000 whites and 15,000 blacks. Georgia's slave code was modeled more on South Carolina's, with all of its specifics for both the whites and the blacks, than, say, Virginia or Maryland, which was more harsh on just the blacks. There were no real revolts, but there was a lot of people running away, especially southward to Spanish Florida. In any event, this concludes the video on the establishment of slavery in North America, focusing on the South.